up, everybody? This is officially now the second episode of Flashback Sessions. Sure Fuze is in the house. Uncommon NASA. As you're listening, or as you're watching, I should say, because this is a YouTube exclusive kind of podcast, subscribe, hit the subscribe button. This show, what we're doing between myself and Sure Fuse is we're just going into all of those indie sessions, not just recording sessions, but times, moments, artists, things that I came in contact with in New York. For the most part, we'll get into eventually some things that Sure Fuse went through in the same time period up in the Chicago area as well. But this is just, really trying to kind of talk about some of those positive things that took place in the indie scene in the late 90s and the early 2000s when I was coming up recording engineering and mixing and all that. I never, as I said in the first episode, like I never really got into talking about that all that much, but we're 20 years out now, so I think now is a good time to sort of document some of these things. And it's for the fans, it's for the people that love this music, that love this indie hip hop, and that have been down for a long time, that want to know sort of some of those backstories. And at least from my hazy, somewhat decent memory, and that's what this show is. So if you're into that kind of thing, subscribe. We're gonna do one of these about once a month on the Uncommon Records YouTube channel, which is where you are right now. So hit subscribe, hit the bell, get an alert. We've got other shows on this YouTube channel as well. Dope Shit podcasts are getting posted here, label updates, of course, music videos, all that. So with that being said, Sure Fuse, what's going on, man?
Going on? It's good to be back. Excited for today's episode, but before we get into that, I just wanted to clean up some misses that we got. Yeah, because we missed a couple things last episode. We didn't know Mr. Cordero's first name. One of the guys involved with engineering the company Flow stuff. So that's his name is Jose Cordero. So I just wanted to make sure he got his proper credit. Word. And then the Beat Junkies are the ones that mixed.
That's right. Yeah, I realized that. Too. I realized that while I was editing.
And I was like, man, I can't believe we missed that one. But that's what we get for. Maybe we're getting old. I don't know.
This is why you people watching need to leave some comments and correct us sometimes. Let us know that you're alive. Give us some comments, man.
And then just for fun, because obviously we're fans first. I didn't think about this last episode, but what's your favorite song from Front Crusher, and then your favorite song from Little John?
Yeah, I mean, to recap anyone finding this video, we're not doing these particularly in order, but they kind of are. So the last time that we spoke, we talked about sort of like the beginnings of how I started working at Ozone, how I met Company Flow, and that sort of thing. And then talked about a few sessions. Things that happened before I was there were Fun Crusher, obviously. That came out when I was a senior in high school to that first summer after graduation. And Little Johnny, which I did talk about a little bit in the last episode, because Little Johnny had been recorded and mixed by the time I showed up at Ozone, so I got to kind of hear it first, and I tell that story a little bit in the last episode too. And I did mention Workaround Emperor as just being mind-blowing, and I would still say that is my favorite song on that record. And Fun Crusher, I mean, it's a classic record, but again, like in terms of like stuff that blew me away that I can remember kind of where I was when I heard it, I mean, Fires in Which You Burn is probably still that jam. So
yeah, that's a good one. For me, I would have to say Last Good Sleep, just because I can relate to it so hard. And then on Little Johnny, my favorite joint is Happy Happy Joy Kill. It's the last joint on the record, just because the way that ends is wild, with them screaming and just wilding out on that. So
that's dope.
But yeah, man. So now that we got the housekeeping cleaned up, why don't you let them know what we're going to be talking about today?
So yeah, I mean, like I said, I was involved in. I was lucky to be involved in a ton of recordings back in those late '90s and early 2000s years, and even later than that. But pre Def Jux, I did a lot of stuff at Ozone, and I was at Ozone for close to 2 years, if not a full 2 years, until they shut down. And one of the releases that really formed me and kind of guided me in the album creation process and just working with artists was this one, and that is Infesticons. So, before we get into any episodes that go a little bit deeper into Def Jux or any of those releases, I wanted to spend some more time on some of the stuff that I worked on at Ozone. And I wanted to, really spend some time talking about this album because I don't think it's underrated. I don't like to call anything underrated anyway because I think it's so stupid. But, you know, I think that maybe it's underappreciated a bit. In the context of sort of indie rap and what it meant. I know for me, you know, a lot of people that do care, about some of the engineering stuff before I started Uncommon Records, like, they're gonna gravitate to Cold Vein and Fantastic Damage and Bazooka Tooth and for good reason. But um I wouldn't have been in the it's almost like this had to happen first. Like Infesticons happened significantly several years before most of those records, and working on this really like prepared me for that, and made it so that I was sort of like totally in the moment by the time some of those Jux records were getting worked on.
Definitely, and it was it was definitely a big record for me when it came out because it was in that vein of everything that was like coming out in that time period. Um, but I definitely agree with you. I definitely would say it's underappreciated. And for the record, I'm not going to put anybody on blast because I don't want them to get attacked online. But I've actually come across a couple of people that said that they prefer the Infesticons record over Funk Crusher. So, uh,
Nice. Hey,
so you know, I mean,
two totally
obviously,
two totally different records that have nothing to do with each other, but okay.
no, for sure. But I think for some people, uh, they they kind of line those two records up in their heads back to back, even
Hmm,
though they came out a couple of years apart.
interesting.
But everybody's got different tastes, and I mean, obviously, Fun Crushers at the top of the near the top of the list for me as far as best indie records of all time, and Fusticons is definitely up there too. So, but they, like I said, they're two different styles, two different vibes. But I think that's what makes that time period great.
Mhm.
Is you almost you don't realize it at the time, but you were spoiled because there was so much good stuff coming.
Yeah, I mean, they both definitely represent that us against them mentality. That would, I guess that's why someone would compare the two, is like they both represent, like, and this is sort of part of one thing I was going to get into a little bit. I mean, this record really is a time capsule. I'm not going to get too much into like, thoughts on like, opinions on, it's like I said in the last episode, like I was there to engineer, you know what I mean? Like, and I love the album, absolutely. But in terms of like evaluating it now, that's for, other people to do. What I want to do is talk about like the actual impact of the record at the time, and like, how we felt making it. And I think, you know, one thing that you hear on this record is something that I don't know if you could even make a record like this today, because it is a time capsule into this mentality of like, if you were young and making hip hop and you were indie in that 90, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001 period, you had grown up on the legends. You had grown up on the major label serious acts, whether it
Right.
was going as far back as BDP and Public Enemy or coming as far forward as Wu Tang and Hyro and Duck Down. Like, those were like, you know, that was the way that you did hip hop, you know,
Right.
and things were changing by the time this record came out, and it's addressed specifically on the album. You know, there's the whole Poof Nana thing, and like, you know, I mean, he's obviously talking about Puffy, and like Puffy was, I can't really overstate how controversial in underground circles Puffy was. Um, and I mean, if you know, people love Biggie, but like people in the underground did not love Puffy. Like, and that's just the way it was. And there were a lot of people that were sort of like maybe over angry about that. And I think this record falls in this weird nexus of like, and I don't know the exact answer to this question because I'm not in Mike's head, but like, you know, as I listen to it now, I hear, because I listened to it just before we started recording. When we decided to do this, I listened a little bit on Spotify, and then I pulled out the vinyl this afternoon. But you know, there's a certain like balance between like seriously making a backpacker record that is anti-mainstream with some humor to it,
Right.
versus making a record that's sort of above both and is making fun of some of the intensity of the backpackers in a loving way, you know.
Right.
And like, and there's like, I don't know which one was more like where his headspace was when he concepted this, or if it was a little bit of both. Probably was. And I still to this day, I didn't think about it then, you know. But that's the thing, like when I was recording this, like again, like it's a time capsule of how people felt. So like, especially for me at 21, you know, being a 21-year-old backpacker, which is what I was when I recorded this, and not knowing a lot of the artists yet on this, I met a lot of these artists for the first time recording this record. None of it seemed unusual to me. You know, it was like, yeah, fuck the Majesticons, you know, like that was
Right.
just the way that I felt, you know. And I think that's how I, you know, got so embedded into this record and so invested in it. And it was, you know, like one of those first records that I really got heavily invested in mentally as an engineer.
Well, the other thing that people, I mean, some of the younger people that are listening to this or watching this, I should say, I don't, they may or may not realize that there was in real time, you could literally feel the split between mainstream rap and underground rap. Like there was a real time split
Yeah.
and it was tangible and it was visible because, you know, I mean, there was independent records, you know, in the 80s and the early 90s, but you know, Company Flow was the, you know, one of the first ones to really like put their feet in the sand and hold the line and say, no, this is the way it's going to go. Because a lot of indie records back in the day were just done to get attention, to get a major label deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you know, this era, there was a tangible split, and you can see it in real time. Because I remember even being in high school, um you know, after Biggie passed away and Puffy started to get pushed more to the forefront, um, you know, with his doing his own music. And supposedly, him rapping was a part of the plan the whole time. Suppose, you know, from what
Mhm.
the stories are.
Right.
So, you know, had Biggie not been killed, maybe it would have still happened. I
It
don't know.
it would, I can tell you why it would have, because a reggae nerd like me can tell you there was a remix of a Supercat song that has Puffy rapping with Biggie while Biggie's still alive. And there's a video for it, and he had like a totally different style. He was trying to like use like a grimy voice and shit. It's pretty amazing if you see it on YouTube. So yes, I can confirm that the plan probably was for him to rap the whole time.
But you know, so that the but you know, for him to do what he was doing at that time, that was throwing it into a lot of faces of people that didn't, you know, we didn't, a lot of people that listened to rap at that time, at least for me personally, like obviously getting money and, you know, having jewelry and all those things has always been a part of hip hop. But like this was one of the times where it was really starting to like be the main focus of songs. And obviously, nobody's gonna ever forget those shiny suits that they were rocking at that
Mm-hmm.
time. So it was just for hip hop heads, it was hard to look at, it was hard to digest, and it was hard to accept.
Well, it was it
So
was it was shocking at the time because like, it wasn't just the imagery or what people were talking about. It wasn't just about like money and cars and all that kind of. I mean, people kind of dumb it down to that in retrospect, but a lot of it was musical. Like through the early 90s, like R&B was like forbidden, unless it was Mary J. Blige, and like that was the way that it was. And like Puffy's entire business model was the merging of R&B and hip hop. Like that was what that label tried to do. That's what Andre Harrell, as the executive producer of Uptown, like where Puffy was working, like that's where he came from. He came from
right,
those guys on Uptown that were trying to do the merging of R&B and hip hop for years in the early 90s, and then he, Bad Boy was sort of an extension of that to a large degree. And so, you know, it was like it was something that people it's hard to explain to people these days that are younger, like how personally people took hip hop then. And it's one thing to I'd like to think that I'm young enough that like if I say that, like, if you're younger than me, you believe me because I'm not that old. Because it's one thing to like listen to like some of the real old OGs say that because you know when you're talking about cats that are older than me that came up in the 70s and 80s, you know, there's sort of a context behind that time period for why people would take music so seriously, especially
right.
in New York. Because this was a completely broken city during that time period. But even into the 90s and even into the 2000s, it continued. And, it was across the board, across the culture. So, a record like this comes along and it just made perfect sense. It really did.
Well, and it's not the only record to touch on the subject, but I think it's one of the best done records to touch on the subject because it doesn't come across corny. It
Hmm.
doesn't come across as, most importantly, it doesn't come across as, you know, jealous or whiny.
Right. Right.
It comes from a real place, and um, listening to it now, like you said, it is a time capsule because rap music in this is inherently different now, but
Hmm.
it's aged really well for what it is, because concept albums are really hard to pull off to begin with, and for something like this to do it for, uh you know I don't even know how many songs. This is like maybe 15, 16.
There's
I don't.
uh there's 13 songs on here.
Yeah, well, so 13 songs to keep the concept going without it getting stale. That's tough to do. So the fact that he kind of mapped this thing out and followed through with it as well as he did, and have bringing in the right people to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get into some of that, because I just like I said, I just listened to the record and again, and it's pretty amazing, like the amount of talent that was on this record. Um, most of the people that were part of this record went on to have long and some continuing careers in music and in hip hop, and you know, this record is a combination of like worlds that I take it like Mike was in at the time because like as I look at this track list, somebody that's coming into it fresh might not see some of these like connecting some of these dots, not be able to connect some of these dots, but like a lot of the people that are on this record were, in the Bronx at the time, so like everything that was recorded at TME, obviously, those are guys that were in the Bronx, and Fred is still up in the Bronx to this day. Rob Sonic was there at the time. Eric Mo, who is the guitarist for Sonic Sum, who's on several tracks here. He's African Scottish, but he was living in the Bronx at the time. Mums was living up in the Bronx. I think he was even roommates with Mike Ladd for a period at this point. Creature who's from the Bronx. So like, you know, and then you've also got the other side of it, which was the poetry scene at the time.
Right.
So, you know, you've got like that New Eurekan scene, what later some of those people sort of got into like the deaf poetry thing. And, you know, so that's where you've got Priest and Beans, and you got Saul Williams, and you've got Liza Jesse Peterson. And Mums kind of fits both of those roles actually, because Mums was part of that too. And then you've got sort of like what was going on at Ozone itself. You know, you've got me recording it, you've got Vassos mixing most of it, and I should say me recording most of it. Some of this was done up in the Bronx too. Um, and you know, you've got Donna, Donna Diaz Tuton, who was part of Applied Science. She was actually working at Ozone at the time before Applied Science got their deal.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so she basically was, you know, an intern slash reception, and you know, she got hired there a little bit after I got hired there to be an intern slash engineer. So, um, you know, so that was there, and there's also like guitar on here from like Don and Steve, who like basically lived at the studio and like recorded their own stuff for they had their own deal. So like basically every all those worlds, and it's really influential on me to see somebody, you know, considering what I ended up becoming later, in my opinion, at least in terms of like being able to bridge the gap between a couple of different generations and a few different scenes in at least in my world, like seeing Lad do this at that time at a young impressionable age, you know, that was really important for me. And it's something to be said for Mike, because all of that pulling of resources together, of pulling of different scenes that he was a part of together, came at the same time. From my point of view, this is just, you know, my view of watching the way it happened. You know, he finished Welcome to the After Future, and I think this opportunity with Big Dada came along either toward the end of that recording process or shortly after that record was done. And you know, I don't think he had really been in a situation of making a production record like this before, of making a concept record like this before, and of trying to do both of those things at the same time with all these different disparate voices for a large opportunity with this like international label, you know. And Big Dada and Ninja Tune were not what they are today in terms of like a legacy label, and they weren't even what they would become a few years after this, which was like a leading label in independent music.
Right.
um you know, they were still on the come up. If you look at the catalog number, it's BD017, so this is only the 17th release from Big Dada, which, you know, at that time, you know, meant like 2.5 years, maybe 2 years, you know, because labels were cracking at that time, because that's the way
Right.
that the business was structured. So, you know, seeing a 17 on this is pretty early in Big Dada's history. But all of those pressures were coming together for him. And again, this is my point of view and my sort of interaction with it. It was probably a lot for him to handle at the time. You know, I mean, you're talking about a younger musician, you know, who had not like sort of reached the destination. You know, all of us can identify with that. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, you know, you haven't reached your destination. You haven't like found your, I mean, he certainly was ahead of where I was at the age that he was then in terms of finding his true voice. But he probably wasn't settled in exactly then yet, even with After Future under his belt.
Right.
And that was a lot, man. And I watched him really, you know, struggle with you know, the pressure of, there was a heavy deadline for this record. We cracked this thing out, you know, once we got to the Ozone portion of recording this. And maybe that was part of the reason why a lot of this ended up going Ozone instead of staying up in the Bronx. Maybe it was a scheduling. I don't really know the reason for that, but yeah, we were on a tight schedule. I mean, we recorded and mixed, you know, for probably a straight 2 weeks, and you know, just banged everything out and scheduled everyone to come in. And you know, just to clarify, because people know me as a mix engineer, I didn't mix anything on this record. I recorded and assisted on probably 2/3, if not 3/4 of it.
This was this one of your like first things that you were involved with heavily, like coming out of your internship? Um, at
Yeah,
the time?
I unfortunately I don't remember the exactly because it wasn't presented in the way of like, here's your first big assignment, NASA. It was
Right.
just like get in the studio and do shit. You know what I mean? Like I was kind of thrown off the edge of the boat. So like I don't remember exactly what my first assignment was, so to speak, of like a major release, or a major project that was like a block, recording session for over a week or so. But if this wasn't it, it was one of the first for sure. And that's probably why it was so formative for me.
And you said that they were you guys were on a tight schedule as far as like getting it done. So it wasn't one of those situations where they're just coming in and vibing in the studio, writing things as they're going along. It was like they had the stuff ready and they were coming in just cranking it out.
Yeah, yeah. Mike sent it's my recollection that Mike had sent this music, the instrumentals along ahead of time. And that
Hmm.
I don't remember anyone writing in studio. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't remember anyone writing in studio. But everyone came in with their stuff prepared. But also you're also dealing with, in a lot of cases, with high level artists, like extreme talents. So and I say that to say, like, you're talking about Mike Ladd, you're talking about Saul Williams, Liza Jesse Peterson, people that come from that poetry background. So I suspect a lot of what you hear, I can get into specifics if we talk about tracks later, um, is a loose outline, because this is what poets do. It's a loose outline, and then they kind of ad lib, through it and do multiple takes, and then we would comp different takes together. And so, to the degree that someone maybe didn't fully write something, yeah, there was some latitude for ad-libbing and vibing, but it wasn't like some other sessions where I was in where my job was to play the beat over and over again,
Right.
like.
No, because it's interesting because I kind of feel like I've never attempted a full on concept record like that. So it's like I would imagine that you would have to have a lot of different. It's difficult to have a lot of different minds on the same page at the same time to have everything kind of come together smoothly and seamlessly like that. So
Well, this is the thing about it, is like, and this record, and this record in particular, I didn't realize the influence it had on me until very many years later. Like, I didn't come away from this record. I mean, I did, but not as much. But like, it wasn't like I came away from this record and was like, oh shit, like, and it's like front mind when I'm writing and producing. You know what I mean? Like that, a direct influence. But for me, when I think about like Written at Night, you know, I didn't realize until like probably recently that like I wouldn't have really known how to do Written at Night had I not been through this session. Because it was a
right.
similar process where like I produced everything and I sent the beats to people and I told them the concept, and I was sort of directing from the shadows the theme of that record. And that was sort of the way this was. I mean, there was no interaction between, like, as far as I know, between like Saul Williams and Priest and Beans on what they did for this record.
Say hello to Havoc, everyone.
Nice. There you go. But there was no collaboration, as far as I know, from different vocalists that were on this. It was Mike. Everyone kind of coming in to what Mike needed for the particular tracks. He had produced a crop of tracks, and I did want to kind of get into this point. Is like, when you listen to the production on this, you know, um, it is one of the best examples of drum programming that really legitimately sounds like a drummer is in there that we mic'd.
Hmm.
And I can tell you from recording it that all of this stuff was programmed on an MPC 3000. If it wasn't a 3000, it was a 62, but I think it was a 3000 that Mike was using at the time. I just know it wasn't a 2. And it was all programmed. Most of it, like he got into this thing where, and I won't reveal what album it is, because I still don't sample snitch. But he got really into this blues record, and a lot of the drums that are on here have a similar feel because he kind of made kits out of that blues record and was able to kind of like manipulate and change stuff around in the MP and chop and move and created these drum patterns. And if you listen to like, there's some songs that break that pattern, but like, if you listen to um chase theme, figurine theme, church theme, monkey theme, cave theme, they all sort of have that same sound to them. And part of that is also credit to Vassos, who I think mixed all of the ones I just mentioned that had that particular feel, but obviously the production is where it starts. So
and those are like some of my favorite songs on the album, just because of the vibe. And I love good drums, and the drums on those songs are cracking, so it's makes sense.
yeah.
See, I mean, I don't know if you would know the answer to this, because again, it seems crazy to have all these people on the same page at the same time, coming with, you know, with the same type of being able to concept these things out almost in a storyboard way. Do you know that if the process was for him to just was he approving their lyrics beforehand to make sure it fit with what he was trying to do, or did he have the kind of trust in them, be like, here's the concept, go write it, and then they were laying it down and he'd be like, oh, okay, that's dope?
It's funny that you say that, because I haven't thought about that in a long time. But as you said that, I do kind of feel like I remember at least some of the artists were sending him like the lyrics and being like, "Hey man, this is what I have. Does it work?" I feel like that happened with at least one or two artists, and this was like the early days of email, so it was probably just copied and pasted into an email or something. I feel like that happened, but I think for the most part, he was very specific about who he chose.
Hmm.
I believe that he did assign particular artists that he wanted to match with particular themes.
Right.
And so, if he had the cave theme, he in his head knew BMS was going to be the person for that,
and
and
it
reached out to BMS and took it
and it
that way.
makes sense because everybody fit perfectly for their parts, to convey what he was trying to get across, which again is a credit to his thought process and his ability to kind of probably have this laid out in his head before he brought it into fruition. Because again, concept albums are not easy to pull off, man. And a lot of them don't age well, but this, and obviously the Prince Paul and some other ones, obviously it's a rarefied air that you can sit down and throw a concept album. And because concept albums are unique because they're there's a theme all across the board, but it's almost like watching a movie. Once you know the story, is the replay value really high? And this, I feel
Mm.
like this is one of those records, even though you kind of know what's going to happen when you put the record on, the story behind it. It still has individual songs have high replay value, which says a lot too. So
He chose the right people, to be honest. I mean, those were a lot of them in particular, like a lot of the sessions were definitely memorable. I mean, I can remember, specifics is asking a lot for 21 years ago, but I can I can remember definitely how I felt and just, I mean, for me, to set some context, at least from my side too, is like, I'm 21 and, I'm a Company Flow fan and I'm a Stretch and Bob listener. And I go to Fat Beats and I go to Wetlands and Tramps and shit. And like, that was like my part of the underground scene. And so, as I said the last episode, when I got to Ozone, I knew about some of the artists, but I didn't know about all of them. I didn't know who Mike Ladd was. I didn't know who Sonic Sum was. I didn't even know who Saul Williams was when I got to Ozone. And obviously a lot of those people show up here. And this album, recording it, really got me to become fans of all those people in a much deeper way. And you know, those are really talented people. So like if you give them, I mean, this record from my recollection started with a crop of beats. You know, he made a crop of beats that he felt fit a particular vibe. And then he would, I believe, at least from the way I remember it, like the crop of beats sort of led to, it merged with sort of like this concept album idea, and they became one. And then that's when he sort of started, sending stuff out. Of course, all of this process, the Genesis process for me, as I talk about it, I wasn't there when he concepted this record or
Right.
even reached out to any of those people. But you get a sense of what's happening when you're in the room with people as they come in and how things are working. So, my role in the record was mainly to record the artists that came in when we were working at Ozone. And, I think this was probably the first time I ever met or worked with BMS. And I was a huge fan of BMS. Like, I loved BMS. Like, I felt like he wasn't on enough tracks, and so like when I got to record him on a whole solo song, that was awesome, because I wanted to hear that whether I recorded it or not. So,
Right.
and he kills it on this. And then again, Donna was sort of working at Ozone, and she's native of Australia, and was here. I think she's still in the States. I don't really know, to be honest. But she was trained operatically. So she either was trained or just developed that talent. And so, folks that are maybe bigger applied science experts than I might be would sort of know some of her roots a little bit better. But she was brought in to do the singing on this, and it was, and she did singing on a few other tracks too. She did some work for Elle, and she's actually on 2 tracks here. Cave Thing being more sort of what I know her for as a vocalist in
Right.
general from her other work as well, because that operatic um that operatic sound over electronic production is sort of, I think, what she's more known for. And this was one of the early examples of it, I think, even for her career. And it was a great song to be a part of. And like, look, when you're 21-year-old engineer and you're learning how to record somebody with pipes like that, that's a huge lesson. Like, how do I mic this? How do I keep this from peaking? How do I run, you know to go onto a different path here with this, and a different tangent, like Ozone was a cool place to learn, not just because of all of the talent that was around me, which was great, or not just because of sort of like this supportive environment that I can talk about a little bit too, but because they had crazy equipment in there, like crazy equipment. Like most of it, I think, was basically, a lot of times back in the day, engineers would acquire pieces. They would acquire equipment, and those pieces would be expensive and but not always be what was necessary in an engineer's given studio.
Right.
So pieces of equipment will get loaned out for long periods of time, either just like, hey, store this and use it while you're storing it for me, or like, hey, give me a couple bucks a month, or give me, whatever, and you guys can use it. I don't know exactly how we got this equipment from. I know it was a gentleman named John Hancock, and Hancock ran independent studios, and he was a mastering engineer and still works in broadcast media, and is an engineer to this day. And a lot of this equipment was his, and the equipment they had in there, man, they had like like real Pultec engineer EQs, and so if you mix, you probably know what a Pultec is from your plugin, or maybe you've seen some of the reissues of them, but these were like legitimate Pultecs from the 60s. And I'm like 21, and this is normal to me, to walk into a studio and just be like, turning a Pultec, and like, oh, let me get the vocals a little better. And so like, recording back then wasn't what it would be today. You know, my recording credits back then were different than what they would be today, because today they would be me, you know, pressing my button, and you know, and there's some work that goes into that. You have to do it right, and you know, it's not like it's an easy job. But back then, we were running vocals through the Avalon down into Pultex, and we were tweaking to tape and to digital tape, but to tape. And so we were recording to DA88. I think eventually we replaced them with ADATs in Ozone. I know at Juxta was ADATs, but we had 3 ADATs. And you know, when you're running 3 ADATs, you got 8 tracks on each, and so you got 24 channels. And when you're hitting play and rewind, you have to be really careful because they're following each other. They're sync. So like, it's 3 giant boats like moving back and forth, you know, like when you're doing it, as long as you have 24 channels worth of stuff. So like, this was a complex situation by comparison to today's environment. And, you know, recording all of these like brilliant people in that sort of room, in that sort of situation, is something that I can't, you know, I can't be more thankful to have that kind of memory, you know, to be corny about it. But you know, I think you know, we can get into like some of the different tracks and some of the different artists too, if you want. But
Yeah,
also,
man.
like, I guess another thing that we're going to talk about is sort of like how I ended up like sort of the beginning too on this project.
Yeah, because that, you know, it's an interesting project to be a part of, obviously, and a lot of people don't know this, but you have an executive producer credit on this album.
I know that was like such a big deal to me back then, man, and it still is to this day. And you know, I could say that like, you know, like the first thing I ever worked on with Mike Ladd was a song called February 4th, 99, which is on Welcome to the After Future. And it was right when I first started working at Ozone. And I was assisting on that project. I didn't record it. And After Future was completely recorded and mixed up at Fred's at TME, except for February 4th, 99. And again, scheduling conflict, needing our equipment instead, or who knows what the reasoning was, but or maybe it was a last minute decision to add another song. I don't really know. I know it was the last song recorded for that album for sure. But February 4th, 99 is about the ridiculous assassination of Amadou Diallo by police in New York in 1999 on February 4th. We recorded the song in 99, probably several months after. For those that don't know, like Amadou Diallo in 1999 was about to walk into his apartment. He was putting his keys in his door of his own home, was stopped by 4 police officers and told to show his wallet for some reason, or to put his hands up with his wallet. He reached for his wallet, and they assassinated him. It was a firing squad. There was no defense for this man at all, and they were far away from him too. So it wasn't even a close situation. It was just, there's never a reason for it, but there was, you know, no reason for it at all here. It was, see, like back then, without videotape, it had to be so egregious. You know, it had to be overly egregious. It couldn't be like one person's word against the other. It had to be like 4 people fire 41 bullets into somebody to get attention, because
Right.
without videotape, it had to be extreme. Sean Bell is another example. So it was obviously very jarring for the city and for everyone. It was, you know, and it shows how little has changed. But that song was like, from a creative point of view, to take that situation and address it the way that he did with this, it was, I still can't really wrap my head around that song and the way that it was done. So anyway, that's how I meet Mike Ladd, and I'm this young impressionable guy, and Mike was probably about, I guess he's probably 5 or 6 years older than me, so he's probably about 25 or 26, 27 at the most at the time. Probably not even. I mean, you know, when you're 20 and 21, everybody is like 40, so who knows. But but I know that he's not that much older than I am. I'd probably be surprised. He's probably like 2 years older than I am, for all I know. But in any case, he ended up coming back, and by the time he came back to do this, I was a huge fan of like Welcome to the After Future, and to this day, I think it's one of the best albums ever made. I had very little to do with any of that record, but you know, as a fan, like one of my favorite albums ever made to this day. And so by the time he came back, I had already kind of felt that way. I was super impressed. And so, you know, I remember him being really cool to me, you know, because I was probably really cool to him. And we got along really well and hit it off during those sessions. And like I had said before, there were a lot of pressures, it seemed, on him in terms of getting things done on time. Certain artists, their schedules would fluctuate. So somebody was supposed to be in a session on Tuesday, but they couldn't make it, and they're not coming until next Saturday. So now he's got this Tuesday time. He's got to scramble and figure out other things to do with that time to keep the record on track. Like, these sorts of pressures were there during the recording process of this album. And I learned, you know, I wouldn't say I learned, that's the wrong way to say it. I moved into the role of, you know, sort of being a confidence booster, you know, and I did that naturally because I really cared about the project, and I cared about his music because I was such a huge fan of After Future that I wanted this to work. And, you know, I can't get in his head, and I can't speak for him, and I wouldn't want to, but I think, you know, like all of us, there are different doubts that come into mind
For sure.
when you're making something. And I feel like those were there at different times for him, at different times of this process. And I was always trying to be like, no, this shit is dope. This is really dope. Like, you know, let's keep going. And I've done that for other artists and other points of their careers. And like I said in the last episode, as an engineer, like, I was strictly told, do not give comments unless you're asked for. And, you know, when that door is open, if I actually believe it, I will encourage people, and be part of that process. And I feel like that relationship for me, you know, is the reason why I ended up basically being awarded, you know, an executive producer credit on the record. And it meant a lot to me, not because I was really making executive decisions on the record, because I wasn't. That's not what that was. That
Right.
was an acknowledgement of my relevance to those sessions, and that the aid that I gave, first of all, bust on my ass recording that thing, and second of all, you know, all night, and, you know, all the other shit that I would do, and, you know, and just my positive attitude that I had about it. And you know, I still have it somewhere, like, you know, at the, like, that. What's funny is, like, these were so close, like After Future's physical product came in like just before, so like there were copies of like the album around, and I remember he signed a CD for me, and, like, you know, wrote like thank you for Infesticons or something like that, like on the After Future sleeve, and, like, you know, signed it and shit. And, like, he was super cool to me, man. And you know, as my career continued, the DNA that was sort of implanted in me by his approach to music and production, and not just beat making production, but production, like, you know, because he was a producer of this record. He did some coaching to some of the artists. No, it should be this, it should be that. You know what I mean? Like the constructive stuff to
Right.
some of the artists, and guided them to the concept in the studio, and guided them to the performance for the beats. Because remember, these beats were unorthodox at the time, even for poets, you know? So, like, there had to be like, no, the rhythm is like this, or, you know what I mean? Like, that sort
Right.
of like interaction took place, I'm sure. And, you know, I learned so much from this project. And like I said, like, there were things that I took directly that I, you know, from day one, as soon as this project was over, I learned something and I kept doing it. And then there were other things that 20 years later, I'm like, oh shit, I did that because of this. Like, and every artist I think goes through that. Influence is a tricky thing. Influence can be direct, it could be front loaded, or influence could be subliminal and backloaded. And I just that's sort of like where I was, and that's where I am, I should say, with this record. And you know that producer credit, that executive producer credit, gave me like so much confidence, um, and really made me feel accepted, and seen for what I was doing, not just on this
Right.
record, but in general as an engineer. And I think that respect, really helped me, and it helped me garner more respect for more people, because what you give, you get. So that was definitely a big moment for me. You
Well,
know.
and it's a huge way to say thank you, and like you said, it's a tangible form of acknowledgement for
Yeah.
your for your work and your passion, because uh
I mean, it's such a
sometimes
great gesture, for a young person to give to another young person. Again, like, we're both well below 30, not, you know, full grown adults, I would think. I can't speak for him, but like, what a great gesture for a young man to do. I could say that now that I'm like, 42. But,
right.
but like, what an amazing thing to do for somebody. That's fucking awesome. I wish I was that nice.
No, I mean, again, it's the recognition of a person's input on an album that he didn't have to acknowledge, because at the end of the day, in that particular situation and an environment, you were doing your job. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but there's a difference of like doing your job and then going above and beyond and showing the excitement for something. Because you can relate it to real world work too. There's times where I just, in my day job, I'm just like, I'm just gonna get this done and out of the way. But then if something comes up where I'm more passionate about it because I believe it's going to be something positive for the company that I work for, I'm going to push it a little harder. So I think that comes through in music too, obviously. So that's a plus. I'm sure for you at that time that was like a confirmation that you were going in the right direction with your music career at the time too. So
Yeah. I mean, imagine, I can't imagine where I would be had I never worked at Ozone. I still would have been a very creative person, and I would have found my way into indie hip hop one way or another. But my musical context would be a lot different. My background would be different, and this is an example of why I say that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't just say that because like I ended up at Jux because I worked there. I say that because I worked on projects like this, and I worked on projects that people haven't heard that were just as impactful for me. But this was a big deal. It was it definitely formed a lot of what I was doing, and what I would become. And I, again, like, some of these sessions were like noon, some of these sessions were midnight, so there are different vibes on different records on it.
do you have any sessions that stand out more than others?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to a couple, like, and it's funny because they're almost like right, well, all of them are actually all back to back. There's a few in a row, like, but um Saul Williams' session was one of the last ones that we recorded. Um and you know, Saul came in at night. Saul had not released Amethyst Rockstar yet. He was working on Amethyst Rockstar at this time. He had just signed to American, or Def American, whatever, with Rick Rubin. And I had recorded some demos for that record, once or twice. But the final recording, like, they flew him to Los Angeles and all that. But and so I don't remember if I had met him or if this was the first time I met him. my interactions with Saul at that time were more as an immediate fan once I heard his music. I think Coded Language had come out like right when I got hired at Ozone, and I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is fucking amazing. And so my interactions with Saul were more of going to his shows, his early shows in New York, places like Brownies and Fez and, um, you know, Joe's. It's Joe's. I forgot the name of that place. It's still there, and it's the one that I don't remember because not a lot of hip hop happens there. But somehow, like Ozone was pulling off events at that venue. It's on Lafayette. But in any case, so that was my interaction, was more seeing him live and seeing him performing and stuff instead of recording his own material. But I just remember that session, and this gets into a lot of the way that Mike was producing at the time, is like, when you listen to this album, if you haven't heard it before, like some of these tracks are very large and epic, and they have multiple I wouldn't say they have beat changes, they have like tone changes.
Yeah,
where like
that's a good way to
the
describe
drums
it.
sort of like continue and do like little rolls and stuff, and then all of a sudden you're in a different, one string comes out and this other new thing comes in, and all of a sudden you're in a different place, but the drums are still in the same spot. And a lot of that happened because, from what I remember, the way that this record was produced and arranged, remember, this is before Pro Tools. Like, Pro Tools existed, obviously, in 2000, but not where we were. Pro Tools was like a $70,000-$80,000
it was
hardware thing that only a certain amount of people had. And a lot of people at that time, because Pro Tools was so expensive, would bypass Pro Tools and just spend, if they had $60,000 or $70,000 to spend, they would buy like an analog board and a rack of ADATs and a bunch of outboard gear, which is sort of more the lane that Ozone was in. Like I said, some of that equipment was borrowed and some of it was purchased, and they built a really nice studio. And we did have a digital board, and this was the age of digital boards for like the engineers in the audience. Like, this was the age of you have a digital board with touchable buttons, analog buttons, that had like an onboard EQ with an LED screen, and you had automation. Automation prior to digital boards was like something that only the high end, SSL boards had, and like Neve boards and those sorts of things. Those analog boards that had the automation in it were super expensive and super rare. And what we were doing with this record, and there were other producers that used our studio in the same way, but Mike did this in particular for this record. He would basically stripe the ADAT with every track that you hear, every sound that you hear. So we would have like, fucking like 21 tracks worth of music before anyone even stepped in a booth in some cases. And then we would record the vocals on those last 3, 5, 8 tracks maybe. And then everything was automated. So almost all of the drops you hear, to my recollection, are automated on a board. So he definitely did some arranging in like song mode on the MPC, but most of it was like, all right, here's the vocalist that comes in. Let's mute these, mute 15, 16, 17, mute that, leave this up, and let him record over just this element of the beat. And we would record it, knock it out, and then after we were in mix mode, before we really mixed, it would be like arrange mode, and Mike would just sit in front of the board. We had a Panasonic Ramza DA7. That was the name of the board. That was what we had, and it was a dope board. And basically on that Panasonic, you would automate, and almost all of the arrangement you hear on here on songs like Cave Theme and Monkey Theme and Figurine Theme, it's just, and actually February 4th, 99 was done the same way. Where like, and that's the one that really will blow your mind. If you listen to that track on After Future, I can remember distinctly like him automating the fade up of the second part of that song.
Oh, wow.
But those instruments, those strings that play on the second part of February 4th are playing the whole time. That's just the faders are down. And so he orchestrated this change, around the vocal. And that was how a lot of this record was produced too. And Monkey Theme in particular, since we're talking about the Saul session, like Saul came in as and I keep saying this, and I don't want to say it to be annoying, but I do want to say it to be honest. These are my memories. Anyone that participated in these sessions may have a slightly different memory. Either one of us could be wrong. But these sessions, like the session with Saul in particular, like he came in and laid down, I think 3 to 4 takes, like just right next to each other. And he kind of like just ad-libbed a bunch of stuff. Like he had, like I said, like a loose parameter. And I saw Mike do the same thing when he recorded different tracks. I think it was just something that people that came from that poet school did, is they would sort of have a loose idea, maybe like, a couple of bars that were certainly written to paper and were read exact, but then they would just kind of vamp off of ideas. And Saul did that on this song for like 4 tracks. And so you hear like the part where he's singing, and there's a part where he's doing vocals, and there's all these different sections. Those were put together because, and I don't believe that we were able to copy and paste them, at least not well. Like when we would copy and paste, it was a pain in the ass because we would like stripe it into Digital Performer and then move it and then bring it back into the ADAT. So we rarely did that. I hated doing that. And I can't even remember how many, it was probably a handful of times that anyone even requested that. So I believe, since knowing that about our limits with copying and pasting, that arrangement really came by the combination of talent and chance. You know what I mean? Like that.
Right.
He did certain things in certain parts, and Mike was able to sit down afterwards and then kind of formulate that just by doing, arrangement on the board automation wise. The beat and the vocals were both just being used as what was there. And through trial and error, he was able to get that to sound like a complete thought. Not that it wasn't before, but you know what I mean? Like a complete arrangement or composition, right. I should say. It obviously was a complete thought. So as a complete composition from beginning to end, and he took those pieces. And Liza Jesse Peterson's session was also very similarly done. So that's why I know it comes from like a lot of those people that came from that poetry school, that's sort of the way that they approach recording. And we had a similar situation, and both of those sessions, I felt like, maybe Mike felt the same way, maybe he didn't, but the vibe for me after seeing and hearing what they did was, that was incredible. But what the fuck are we gonna do now? It was kind of like, this is like so much material, and because those beats on those 2 particular songs are so detailed and so like overproduced in the best way possible, that there was just so much to work with. And that was all Mike, obviously, doing that in making them the songs that they are today. But that process wasn't easy either, and also credit to Vassos, because the sort of like pitch warping and weird effects on Liza's vocals, and the some of the flanging on a lot of the bass lines throughout the record, and even drums on Quarterback Theme, there's like flanging on the drums. Right. I mean, that's all coming from Vassos. That's just him fucking around. Like, he was very influential on me he was the main influence on my mixing style. Like, Elle told me years later, like, look, Vassos taught you a style of doing things, and you took it further than he took it, and that's sort of where you are. And that's not to say that I was better than Vassos. but I did it for a longer time, and I stuck
Right.
with sort of like his blueprint of how you organize mixes and how you use effects and how you sit vocals. And I did it for far longer than he did, and I'm still doing it, whereas he's not, as far as I know. And so, I was able to obviously put my own thoughts, and I built on top of that foundation that he gave me. I built the house that I mix in. And so I listen to this record and I hear things that I would do later. Like the flanging and the phasing and some of the ways that he worked with bass and vocals are things that I could hear that I did later on some of the early Juke stuff. And so that was kind of interesting listening to this too, because I did not mix this record, but it sounds like that, because
Right.
the man who taught me to mix, like I went to school, but nobody teaches you how to mix a record in school, and nobody teaches you how to mix indie hip hop records in school. So
Right.
like he taught me how to do what I do. Um, and you can hear the lesson plan on this record, and that's a big thing. And you know, I mean there's other moments that I had, like, I had just started listening to Sonic Sum because, again, like I wasn't familiar with them before I started working at Ozone. So when Rob came in, I was excited about that session. You could see Rob Smith as the credit here because that's what he was performing as while he was part of Sonic Sum, and Sonic Sum was still together at this time. So he was just Rob Smith. And that chorus is just fucking so dope. Like it's just so grimy. And I remember hearing that chorus. I'm gonna butcher the lyrics, but it's basically like, and I just heard the song a few minutes ago, but resting like a bus, fog lights and blah, blah, it basically he's saying in like this abstract way of like being exhausted and making noise, but still trying to be quiet in like this metaphor about like an old bus. And explaining anyone's lyrics ruins them. So don't listen to me. Go listen to the fucking song. But at 21, like, he was my age. I mean, he still is. Like, he's only about a year or two older than I am. So like that was a big influence on me, seeing somebody that was the same age as me that was not as well known as some of these other people, like do something incredible. Um, was a big deal for me too. And I'll also talk about Church Theme. Um, Church Theme's kind of funny because it's by Pastor Khan, which obviously is Mike, but um the whole theme of the song is that he's like this robotic, like grimy pastor, and he's like preaching and trying to bring peace to like the Infesticons and the Majesticons and all of it, but he's still grimy himself and all this. And I remember for that session, hopefully I'm not speaking out of school, 20 years statute of limitations, but he got drunk for that session. So like I could remember we he basically couldn't get in the right headspace, I think, to do the character.
Mm-hmm.
And it was early too. Like a late night session, it probably would have been easy. But this was like fucking like 11 o'clock in the morning, noon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon shit. And we're, Ozone, for those that don't know, was downtown Manhattan in the business district. It was like an island to itself, like in this part of Manhattan, especially then. Like downtown Manhattan is different now because there's so much work from home and technology. Back then, like if you worked in downtown Manhattan, you were probably working in a Wall Street oriented field, or you weren't, or you cooked in a restaurant or something. You know what I mean? Like, so
Right.
like doing a recording studio down there was super weird and unique is a better word for it. And it was awesome because being from Staten Island was great because once I got off the ferry, I walked to work. So you can't beat that. But anyway, so, headspace is not really there at that time to do this kind of like rambunctious song where you're playing a character. And so I don't know exactly where, I mean, Ozone had alcohol. So like, I don't remember what he was drinking. It was hard liquor. I was so young that I didn't know anything about liquor then. Like I only knew about beer, and I didn't know much about beer yet either. And it was before you knew about beer. Like back in that time, like nobody knew about beer except for bartenders, like, or not even drunks, because drunks would just drink Bud. But like, you know, so like nobody knew stuff then. At least I felt that way. People knew about liquor, but I did not because I was 20. I mean, I wasn't even like legally allowed to drink for half of these sessions. And so, you know, he had some kind of hard liquor and probably from the ozone cabinet or who knows what. And he just at one point was like, "We gotta take a walk. Let's just go take a walk." And he's already kind of lit, and so like we just start walking around downtown Manhattan, and he's just getting. I guess he was getting. I wish I could ask him, but like I kind of want to like keep it to like I'd like to have my memories corrected. You know what I'm saying? Like instead of just asking everyone everything, because sometimes people don't remember what they did themselves either.
Right, right.
But I feel like he was trying to kind of get into the character and trying to loosen up and like get you know what I mean. And so we start walking around downtown Manhattan, and I don't remember much except for like some loud activity in the streets, but I do remember like going into what was probably a Dwayne Reed. It was a drugstore, and I can remember being on an escalator with him, and he was a couple steps away from me, and so he just started like I don't know what he was saying. I wish I could remember, but it was attention getting, and he was just talking shit on this escalator to people coming up the opposite way of the escalator. So like you're in a Dwayne Reed and like we're going down and people are coming up and he's like talking shit to these people and they're laughing. It was whatever he was saying was like shit talking, but it was still funny. Like he wasn't being rude or crass, but like, and I just remember like causing a scene with him basically, and then coming back to the studio. And like once that happened, he was set, and we went in the studio, and he did that in like a couple of takes. You know what I mean? Like, and that was Church Theme.
Damn,
And
that's crazy. He's like he had to get the switch turned on.
Yeah, I mean,
Get into that character.
yeah, absolutely. And you can hear how it's mixed. It's mixed with the vocals in the cut a little bit because it's really about just like it's about that energy, and that was a lot of this record was just capturing a vibe. This is a super vibey record. And yeah, I mean, Church Theme was a fun time, man. I learned I learned that you should drink when you do vocals. Because I mean, for a long time, this just sound really corny when I say this, but like for a long time, I can remember when I discovered that I could record a little bit looser and a little bit better by drinking. I was like, oh, this is like that Mike Ladd shit. Like this is exactly what I need to do. Like I need to be lit, like because and I say that not because of that, but because like I'm me, like I'm a very serious person. Sometimes I'm over serious.
Right.
And I'm very strict. And when I was in my 20s and 30s, I was way more strict than I am now. Now, I'm super chill, like compared to the way I was then. But back then, even in that session, I can remember turning down like alcohol just so that I could be the sober one that captures this moment. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, and that was the kind of geeky shit that I was on and continued to be that way all through all these times, and that's how it was. So like there's all these little influences on what I did in this record. And I think the most important thing that I got from this record, as you said, like is probably one of my first, projects. Is just the cycle, the recording cycle. And we talk because we've worked on several albums together from beginning to end, and you've watched me work on others, and I talk about it all the time, how important the repetition of the album cycle is for a producer, for an artist, for an engineer, and just going through it and then going through it again, then going through it again. When you're the kind of artist that thinks that they're going to make an album and it's going to be successful and then that's it, like you're not prepared for this world. It's not what it's about. It's about doing an album and then doing another album, doing another album,
for sure,
doing another album until you're dead. Like that's the way that the album cycle process works. And every time you go through that cycle, you get better at it. And for me at this time, it was about being an engineer. You know, when I started on this project, I probably was just sitting. I don't think I pressed record on the BMS sessions. I think that because that was one of the first sessions of that hit Ozone of this. When they came in, Hero Theme was already recorded and mixed because it was a single. It's back there. But Hero Theme was already recorded and mixed and was damn near pressed up. It was, if I remember right, and I definitely could be wrong about this, I feel like that single kind of opened up Big Dada to wanting an album. Maybe that's not correct. Maybe they signed it and then that they wanted a single first, and that's how that came to be. But I know the single was done far in advance of the album release, at least from you know I mean, back then, like 3 months was a long time, so who knows? But far enough that I remember it being a gap there. And where's I going with this? Oh, so they came in with Cinderella Theme was recorded by Fred, and Hero Theme was recorded by Fred, and mixed up there too. And I think Tiger Theme was as well, if I remember right. There's a couple of credits that I noticed in here today that aren't exactly accurate. Because like Cave Theme, like I know that we recorded BMS and Donna, because obviously BMS and Donna were kind of coming from those Ozone connections. So maybe Mike recorded some of his stuff up there, but whatever he did on the track or whatever it is, there's typos that happens. But yeah, those songs, there were a few others that were recorded uptown, up in the Bronx, but like I said, for whatever reason, we're lucky enough to have this as a project. And like I said, like it taught me like that process that like it's not pretty, there were ups and downs. Like I said, like there were stresses, there was deadlines, there were cancel sessions and move sessions and sessions where I'm sure there are points where it was just like, what, let's just come back to this tomorrow. I'm not feeling it today. Like it was that kind of record. And you have to go through that to make a record like this,
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's sort of one of the main points of it.
No, man, I agree 100%. And the points that you made about the repetition and getting the reps in, I mean, I could definitely relate to that because, I mean, this because we've worked together for so long, but like there was significant gaps between projects for me this last go around. So like this experience of doing the guillotine stuff and then going into other stuff immediately, that's a huge difference. And I think it makes it more fun when you're doing it more frequently, because because I remember, off tangent a little bit, but I remember when I came out to do Autonomy, that was a hard record to do because a lot of it wasn't fun because I just didn't have the confidence. So that goes, and that it makes sense why you were the way you were during those sessions for me, because you were my cheerleader through a lot of those recordings, because there was times where I was like, oh man, I don't know about that. You're like, no, it's dope, leave it. And I left with a skeleton of an album. So that would explain, you were subconsciously, you probably went back to this time and was like, oh, I've done this before, we're good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that like being in studios really gives you, is like it gives you foresight. I was developing that tool, even during this time, of like imagining what something would sound, even if it's not me, imagining what they could do with it. In this case, it was my knowing what After Future was to me, because I was actually at the mastering session for After Future. I don't know why I was there. I guess just to learn things, but I was there. Like John Hancock mastered it, and I was at Independence and just sitting on the couch. And I remember, and I was like, there were a couple of songs that I hadn't heard before, that I heard for the first time in that session, like Red Out of Jupiter in particular. I had not heard until the mastering, and then when the album came out, obviously I heard the whole thing. But knowing that record and what it was, I knew what he could do with this, and so I had that vision for it. Just as a lowly 21-year-old engineer, I had the confidence that this was going to turn out great because of who I was working with. And, you know, like I said a little bit earlier, like all these people that are on this record, pretty much to a man and woman, like have all gone on to do great things. I mean, like Liza Jesse Peterson, like did like a solo woman show, and was part of like the 13th, you know, Ava DuVernay's um, film on Netflix. And, you know, Mums, of course, went on to be on Oz and is an actor to this day. Yeah, I can go on and on. I mean, you know, the talent on here is crazy. And, you know, and those are two of the names that people might be sleeping on for one reason or another.
No,
You
for
know?
sure. I
And
mean,
you still got Saul, and, you know, you've got like, you know, all these other people that went on to do incredible work, you know. But you know, being a fan of the music and a fan of the culture, like I understood to some degree who I was in the presence of. You know, I knew that these were the people. You know what I mean? Like these were like, you know, the right people. These are the right people to be in the room with in terms of like talent, you know, and seeing artists. You know, I mean, these are some of the best artists that I've ever, you know, come in contact with.
well, special. I mean, special people on artistic levels like that. I mean, you got Beans, BMS, um, you know, L. You have, you know, all those people have special vibes. So you just know, even though you may like to,
Yeah.
you know, take you out of that context. Even if a person didn't know who those people were, you could know that there was something special about them just by the energy that they give off. You know what I mean? So I that doesn't surprise me that you felt that way about something, you know, because uh this I mean, not to, I don't say this lightly as, you know, some big exaggeration. For people that haven't listened to this record for a long time,
Mm.
I would recommend going back and listening to it now as an older person, because
Yeah.
you'll be able to pick up on things that you might not have picked up on when you heard it in your early 20s, mid 20s. And it really is an epic album, like
Hmm.
epic in the sense of the way it sounds. It's really big. There's lots of things going on, but it's not overwhelming. It's not a hard listen in the sense of like, you know, the subject matter, because it's laid out for you in the beginning in the Cinderella theme. So
Hmm.
it's really great the way that it's put together. And again, you know, as we've been saying the whole time, everybody fits perfectly in their parts. Uh,
Yeah, I
so
mean, I think, you know, this is a much deeper grouping of messages wrapped inside of a concept of underground versus mainstream music and hip hop. Like there's a lot deeper stuff going on this record. I mean, I give you an example. It's an extreme example on the record. Is like I remember recording Saul when he did the Cuckoo Cuckoo and Human Zoo stuff. And, you know, being a 21-year-old white guy, like, I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, you know, okay, cool, I'm with it, you know, like, but I didn't really understand what he was talking about and why he, you know, besides making points, you know, against like, you know, white supremacy or whatever. But like
right,
now as an adult, like, I'm like, oh shit, like he was referring to the actual, most likely, I don't know for a fact, but like, you know, was most likely referring to the actual human zoo and like, you know, the shit that went on at the Bronx Zoo. And like, I'm just like, wow, like, you know, I fuck would I know that then? You know what I mean? So
right.
like there are definitely things on here that even if it's not like knowledge based growth, you know, like that example, like just context growth. And I think it's important to point out, and this is what is so impressive about all of these people, is like these weren't 40-year-old people making this record in
No,
1999. You know, like these people were way ahead of the curve of most of us, you know, in terms of just their life experience and knowledge and you know the professionalism that they put into the music that they made
yeah,
was way ahead of where I
because
was. I mean, I was, you know, like, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, Beans is only in his mid 40s, and you know, I think Mike Lab might be in just past his mid 40s. So these guys were in
Hmm.
their early 20s, mid 20s,
Yeah.
and you know, in when you hit 40, you know, when you hit our age, which is, you know, 42, soon to be 43, um, you know, you think you know a lot of shit when you're 23, 24, 25, but you know nothing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah,
you
nothing. Yeah.
I mean, you do know some things,
Well,
hopefully,
these
at that
people
point.
knew a lot.
But
That's what's scary,
but
like,
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, and that just shows
yeah.
you, and it could even go back to um the context of today, because I see it all the time on, this kid's only 23, 24 years old, you got to give him time to grow, because
Right, yeah.
the way music is now, people will literally record a track and they'll throw it online,
Mhm.
whereas back in those days, you did a lot of your growing behind closed doors.
Yeah, absolutely.
um and if you had good people around you, um you had people that would tell you that shit is not as dope as you think it is, you got to keep working. So hopefully by the time you got into an environment, like Ozone, or you know a bigger studio, you were already pretty semi polished and had your style down for the most part. And there's obviously pluses and minuses to having those kinds of opportunities versus now, because depending on the situation, growing in real time might be beneficial depending on what the situation is. But if you're just some rando SoundCloud rapper that's just throwing tracks up in real time and then going to get $1 million deals, there's not a lot of room for error there. um in that context. So again, it just goes to show the ability and the talent that is involved with a record like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is crazy when people say, "Oh, you gotta," and there are some people that need time to grow
Yeah,
in
for
their
sure.
20s. I needed more time to grow than all these folks did. But with that being said, it is possible to be fully grown artistically at an earlier age. It's
For
possible
sure.
to never mature musically. So it doesn't have to do with age is nothing but a number. But it is. It you could be making like, stuff that moves 55-year-old men to tears at 25. It just depends on who you are and what context your music is. And there's a lot of potential out there, um, whether it's 2021 or 2000 rather, when this came out. I mean, most of the stuff was recorded, I think, during the summer and fall of 99, and then the record came out in 2000. um, so 22 years ago. um, the visuals of it are in my head as fresh as they were, you know 21 years ago.
Yeah.
I hope that I laid out like some details for some of the people that are fans of the record that they might not hear otherwise. And that's the point of the show. That's what we're trying to do. It's really for the fans of the music. If I can be the fly on the wall for some of these albums that everyone would like to have had access to, then that's a great thing. And you know, we've talked about this off the air before. Like, you know, nobody's getting any younger. We're not getting any younger, and so it's just documenting the history of this culture. Um, Not just the history of hip hop culture, the history of underground music culture, and frankly, like, some of the role that you or I have had in it, is important. It's important not to let people write your story for you. um
No, for sure. And you know the the there's obviously huge moments in this era, so I thought it was really
yeah.
important that especially you, because you actually suggested that we do it. So
Hmm.
again, not that this record is underrated, because I'm not really a big fan of that word either, because um underrated kind of, to me, and I'm sure maybe to you as well, implies that uh there's just not enough there, and I don't think that's always the case.
I see it as like an artificial level of success or notoriety that is completely gelatinous and hard to put your hand around. Like, how would you based on what measure, like,
Right.
because especially when you're talking about records in that 90s and 2000s era, you're really still talking about a regionalist era,
Yeah.
the strength of a particular indie release is going to be stronger in certain places. It's going to be valued in other places, whereas releases that come along, you could think about like catalogs like Company Flow or Doom. Those early releases were gigantic in New York, but like other people in other places didn't hear those groups until releases later. It's probably the same for Mike's career.
Yeah.
So um, I don't know. I don't, I have been referred to as underrated myself, and I'm kind of like, by who? I
Yeah.
think I
Yeah.
think I'm rated just fine, like I'm probably rated at the level of talent and skill that I have, which is somewhere where a couple people know who I am. So I'll take I'd rather take that than be criminally underrated. And so that's why I wouldn't like, put that on anybody else, and
No.
I think, and look, to somebody who's in that big data Ninja Tune sphere heavy, like this is their excursion into New York indie hip hop. Like people that are really into that sort of trip hop, electronic, borderline hip hop music that Big Data is known for. This was like their record that they got to hear some ill indie vocals,
Yeah.
on that they may not have been exposed to otherwise, maybe not being Americans or New Yorkers. Um, and I think it has a huge place in that history. That overshadows a lot of records that on the American side we may think from that era are bigger than this one,
Right. And I just quick side note, because part of me was really excited but also disappointed. So when you and I first talked about doing an episode on this record, I owned it when I
Mhm.
was younger, but I lost my copy. So I've owned it digitally, and then we were talking. I was like, oh, let me look on Discogs and see, what it's going for. So I'm expecting it to be up there in the in the Fun Crusher sphere, over
Mhm.
$100 at least. So I was like thrilled that I found a sealed copy from some dude in Utah. I sealed copy, brand new, in you from Utah for $25 after shipping.
Mhm.
So the collector in me was like, yes, I got a score, but then the curator and purist in me was like, man, I should have paid way more for this record. So it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
you
for
just
sure.
you just
I,
never
I
you
feel
just
that way
never
about
know.
so many records from this time period. The vinyl values for these records, because so many were pressed at the time.
Yeah.
Not speaking specifically of this album, but in general, indie hip hop releases. Look, if you don't know, like if you love music from this time period and you want them on vinyl, you should go to Discogs, because unfortunately and fortunately, you can get pretty much anything you want for a pretty low price.
Yeah, I mean,
There are some
people.
exceptions. Fondle stuff can go for a decent amount of money depending on which release it is. But other than that, yeah, I mean, it's like the same price that we paid back in the day, like $4.55 for most of
Yeah,
these
I
12
mean,
inches. So,
there's
you know,
12 inches that I've gotten from the early Jux era that are like, $5 brand new sealed, and it's like, but again, that was, you know that was the way it was.
back
Things.
then, so many copies got pressed because
Yeah.
there was always a justification to press more, because that's what the distributors wanted. They wanted more product. And there was always a justification to do that because there were so many DJs and there were so many stores. And so every store needed a player copy or two. Every DJ needed a copy or two. So there was always a reason for more and more and more to be pressed. And that was great at the time in the moment. But, when you're talking about the collector's market, it's, it devalues all those records. It's just like, it's the same reason why you can get a copy of Dark Side of the Moon, for $1 in any record store in the country, because they made fucking like 10 billion of them. So like
Right.
it record collecting always comes down to how many were produced. It's not about what album was great. For collectors, a lot of times the great album is also the rare album, but that's just by coincidence and by human
Right.
nature. It's not actually why those records are worth a lot of money, just because they're good. They're rare because nobody made a lot of them. Anyway, good tangent. So we'll wrap this episode up. The last thing that I'll say, comedically but seriously, is that since making this record in 1999, I have not been able to eat Cape Cod chips without feeling guilty. It's a shampoo theme reference, but I literally he uses Cape Cod chips, which in the Midwest they probably don't even exist. But Cape Cod chips, oh cool. So Cape Cod chips, somehow he basically made them into a yuppie food on that song, and I have never eaten them again. So he's completely ruined their business for me for years. And probably hurt their market share because you don't see them around like you did back then in '99. They were in every deli back then, and it's kind of like, oh shit, Cape Cod chips, like that shit is super rare. So
now they really are a yuppie food.
Now they are, yeah. Now they're like hipster food. They've been gone from the yuppies to the hipsters. You got to really be on on your shit to know about them. But yeah. So if you like these kind of conversations, again, subscribe to the channel, Uncommon Records channel here on YouTube. I have tried to kind of make it a goal of mine and for the label as a whole to sort of stop running like our YouTube channel like it's the 90s and just posting videos to it every 8 months, and actually do some fun stuff. All of us know how to use Zoom now. All of us know how to use cameras now. So why not take advantage of it and do stuff that's fun, like this? So if you're down for that, hit subscribe. Please comment below if you have any memories of this record, favorite songs. If you have any further questions of me that I might be able to answer, maybe about the process for this record, put it down there. If you have any suggestions for future topics, put it down there. Commenting and liking in the first place helps the video get shared, but we also really want to be able to have that back and forth. And if we get enough questions over the first 5 or 6 videos, we'll probably do like a breakout Q&A episode or something like that. So there's all kinds of fun shit that we can do. And like I said, there's a lot of different kinds of content on this YouTube channel, but Flashback Sessions is one of the key parts of it. So that's it for us.
Peace.